my introduction to PGS was through understanding Dharani and the work of Timbuktu Collective. We are currently engaged in a work which is a fairly detailed case studies of 15 farmer producer organizations across the country, and some insights on that relating to sustainability is something I'd like to share today. So I have a small compendium of about 22 blogs. I have a few copies, but this is freely available. And this covers some of the 15 case studies as well. One of them happens to be a PGS member, I think Umang Mahila from Grassroots. And so we were trying to understand a little bit on issues of sustainability there, but these blogs are essentially trying to find out through a combination of people who have been both practitioners and academics on what's actually happening on the ground relating to the FPO story. So I'll briefly start with the story of FPOs as we are able to see it today. And again, more as a, an observer, not necessarily as a direct participant in it. So I had an opportunity to be part of the expert group to recommend the direction for, FPOs in India. And I think this is a new kind of ways in which public policy is being formed in India today. So you're mentioned as an expert group, but you have to pay your own money to go to Delhi and be part of a Government of India discussion. So, and I think some of that got captured in this piece in Seminar's article on rural agriculture and livelihoods in December. So essentially, it's a period where the title of that paper is Consultation or Consultants. So after having made, some observations, of course, pandemic also happened during this period when the policy was formulated. There was too much focus on the farm laws, rightly so. But at the same time, the FPO policy was also pushed, again, with very little consultation. We tried doing some consultation from groups that were engaged with it. And finally, when the policy was kind of announced and we ended up in Delhi, we actually saw the document already there. And then when we looked at the formulation of the document, it had very little to what we had recommended. It's basically a consulting agency that had written the whole policy document for the Government of India. And they were expecting that they will become what was called the National Project Management Agency. But I think the fact is that they lost out to another bigger consultant. But the formulation of the policy was in such a manner that you should have a 50 crore turnover, which means only 4 of the top consulting firms can do that. Some of the NGOs got together and said, can we form a consortium? Because individually we cannot, make this. That was not allowed. The new policy of creating cluster-based business organizations insists that unless you have a 2.5 crore turnover a year, you cannot be part of any initiative. So that completely rules out many, grassroots level organizations in trying to build what is called the FPO movement. And earlier, NABARD used to depend on many of them to try and actually push their numbers. Now, suddenly, overnight, they are kind of removed. And everyone is in a quandary. I think Ramu and others will know it very well, is that you're damned if you are selected as a cluster-based business organization, and you're damned if you do not. Because if you do not and you choose not to, somebody else might come and start forming, an FPO in your own region. And you sometimes may not even have an autonomy to decide what should be the nature of the form of organization. So if you happen to be under NCDC, it has to be a cooperative. If it is under SFAC, it has to be a producer company. And NABARD is slightly more flexible. And I think some of this ideas of the language is about Sahkar ke se Samriddhi, the cooperative ministry's principles. But I think all the formation and the institution building process is actually going against some of the basics of the cooperative ethic. The sense of autonomy of local institutions and member-driven institutions to determine the nature of things is sometimes being undermined. And that is probably happening at a very big pace through the 10,000 FPO policy. And what we hear from the ground is actually the story because of the high target-driven nature. We are actually suggesting now at the ground that you first register the organization and then you mobilize 300 members. So, and the targets are there. By July, I don't know whatever the date is, that you have to have 300 members. So, it's in this context, these 15 case studies that we are looking at seemed a little bit more interesting because all these 15 were set up before these, this policy was created. There's certain parts of the earlier system which might need to be rethought, and one of which was the fact that there was a feeling that social mobilization was generally given far too long a time, and we should get into the engagement with the markets as quickly as possible. So some of the earlier organizations had the kind of grant support from other sources which enabled them to build pharma institutions across. And now we are saying you don't need to do that, get a, somehow or the other get farmers together and then try and see how they can engage more with the market. So, I won't go into the details of it. We are currently in the process of trying to put together the synthesis of all these 15 cases and trying to see what kind of picture might emerge. And how are these FPOs slightly different from a regular kind of enterprise? So some of this has also been in trying to analyze their, their turnovers, profits over a long period of time, and trying to see what kinds of things, how long does it take for an FPO to be profitable, and those elements as well. Of course, gender representation might be a point as well. This sample is slightly biased because the selection, not slightly, I think highly biased, because the selection has been based on working with organizations which have been civil society organizations that have been involved in the promotion. So out of the sample of 15, I think 7 of them are women-led FPOs, which is not the case in the overall number of 14,000 FPOs that we have in the country. But just in terms of trying to put together some ideas on what's the picture that's emerging, I'll just mention that briefly and then try and focus a bit more on the issue of sustainability. So one of the things we did find in this process is so one of the things we know now is that the socio-political context of smallholders has changed considerably. And much of our baggage is from the cooperative movement, which sometimes tends to have large numbers, maybe running in 10,000s and so on, or even 5,000, 3,000, etc. The nature of the new kinds of organizations, we are not able to mobilize that kind of numbers. It has an implication on the share capital and how much you can leverage that. But this is the reality, and institutions need to be built around this nature. So we are not talking of dairy producer companies, which is more or less again working out with the kind of scale which NDDB has been able to promote. So broadly speaking, in terms of incubation of these farmer organizations, we found there are 2 levels at which there were some that were organic and some that we call project mode. So project mode are organizations that are not having a grassroots presence, and they have got a grant from SFAC or NABARD to try and promote a local institution. And there is a clear market difference between their ability to mobilize social capital and those which have been rooted, have been able to use the social capital very well, which is so essential, especially when the nature of shocks that an enterprise faces in agriculture. Dairy cooperatives, again, the story is rather different, which we have studied quite a bit. So all their graphs are always going up in terms of profitability, revenue, turnover. And here we see lots of ups and downs in many of the FPOs that we are studying. And there are many features of the finances as well, which we have kind of understood, is sometimes there are amazing spikes that happen in the, in the overall progress. And one of this is due to the MSP. So if the FPO is enabled to try and take up MSP, then there is a high high revenue and so on. But the biggest problem is that there's such an uncertainty about it. So it's like, everybody loves a group drought. Everyone likes a good MSP. But the fact of the matter is the next year there is no MSP. It's extremely good for the farmer, very bad for the FPO in terms of its business profitability, because next year there is no certainty. So it falls down, it upsets sometimes the way they could do business as well. So I'll not get into the details of the finances and so on, but let me just look at this issue of the point about sustainability, which I'd like to touch upon briefly. And I think still this is a work in progress. And the main point, essentially, the logic of saying that market access is so important, and essentially production issues have been solved, and it's only the market that we need to work with. And that's been the broad logic in which we are looking at in terms of producer organizations. There is more value to be got in output markets, and therefore sometimes let's do work with NCDX, get involved with commodity markets and so on. But the actual fact is that all the FPOs, and a very important contribution for the farmers is actually their agricultural extension services. And by the nature of it, in the way it works for the business model, agricultural extension services are activities that they are public goods. Farmers are often not in a position to pay for them. Public extension is in disarray in most places. Private extension is extortive. They're called merchants of knowledge, as people say, because they will be pushing things which are not necessarily good for the farmer or the soil. And there is this big gap where community-based extension, the kinds of things that we are talking of in terms of peer-to-peer learning, etc., is missing. And many of these FPOs have been providing this very useful service. The challenge essentially from a public policy point of view is who supports this activity. Farmers cannot pay for this, but this is a public good that needs investment. And this is a very important public good. And the challenge in terms of public investments is the fact that if these elements are recognized better, today you have individual loan waiver of a farmer, but a collective enterprise of an FPO is taxed. Even though there is a case that, we will not tax you for 100 unless you're less than 100 crores for the next few years. You look at their balance sheets, everyone's ending up paying a certain amount of tax. Now, why is it that collective enterprises are not able to be invested sufficiently in terms of public investments? And while we talk about the amount of, the 6,300 crores that's supposed to be going into FPOs, if you look at the actual investment in each of these organizations, it is very clear, as we say, they're born weak, the investments are so underinvested. With NABARD's typical scheme, 9 lakhs in 3 years. It's a good way to kill an enterprise. You don't give enough money because if it's an enterprise, you need to do that. If it's a startup, you will put that kind of money. But if it's an FPO, you say, no, this is farmer stuff. We don't need to put that kind of money. We'll manage somehow or the other. And this magical feeling that after 3 years, they'll become so independent that they can pay the CEO salaries and other kinds of things. No startup is able to work within 3-year time frame, but a farmer producer organization that's so complex in its operations with lots of governance issues and so on is expected to be so profitable in 3 years. The empirical basis for the policy is actually very, very weak. So if you look at agricultural extension, that's a big element of it. So we talk about food systems today, they are under severe threat. So I think the broader issues of sustainability, look at fertilizer subsidy today in this year is expected to touch 2.5 lakh crores for various kinds of reasons, including the Russia-Ukraine war. Who's going to pay for this? And it is no more an option that we need to move towards a more sustainable future. We can continue to debate whether that has to be organic or natural or chemical free, etc. Terminologies are there, but clearly the direction, I don't think we have too much of a choice in that. And I think in this kind of shift, because the business model of FPOs have been often predicated, we are talking about large number of FPOs, not necessarily the ones that many of you may be involved in, is the feeling that our FPOs just meant to be the last mile delivery of agri-input companies. They are able to reach a certain number of farmers, unfortunately not able to meet small and marginal farmers, tribal farmers, women farmers. Now through an FPO, let it be even certain kinds of startups in the agri-tech space, FPO is a nice vehicle so that I can get my chemical fertilizers and inputs and pesticides there. Most of these 10,000 or 14,000 FPOs are largely working on the input side. Margins are thin, but nevertheless, it seems to provide a certain kind of recourse. Now, is that going to be the basis on which we want to talk about the future of, farmer or producer organizations? And I think the challenge essentially, and we are still at a very early stage of this articulation, and therefore some of the discussions on the PGS becomes important, because the element of sustainability is coming very strongly. So can producer organizations bring the concept of sustainability in the business model of FPOs? And so we do need intermediary organizations between the farmers and the markets. Sometimes FPOs are playing this space. Clearly, we should not rely on civil society organizations to do this. They can do it for a while, excellent in social mobilization and so on. But the interface with the market actually changes things. With the markets and the consumers, here you want a 10-minute delivery with Zepto or whatever is there. Luckily, I don't think we have this in some other cities in North India. But that's the nature of consumer demand and behavior that's there. Markets are changing so much, and you want to talk with these kinds of institutions. So we really need institutions that can make this interface between the farmers and this very dynamic, highly imbalanced power brokers who are telling you what needs to be done. And I think that is where producer organizations, with all their limitations, have been able to do a little bit of being the voice of farmers with all its difficulties that we see. So broadly, I think while FPOs can play a role in natural resource management, ecosystem, etc., some of them in our own cases have foregrounded sustainable agriculture practices through extension activities. We asked all the 15, where do you see yourself in sustainable agriculture? Is that a market differentiator or not? I think there were 2 or 3 that clearly said, like say Ram Rahim Producer Company, for them selling it as an NPM product is a market differentiator. Mahila Umang possibly does that. Sometimes others do a mix of it. Kalani, what we found that they actually used smartly certain elements where they felt that the bananas that they were selling locally wasn't really giving them enough margins. And I think they worked in such a manner that they even used blockchain technology and to ensure this issue of traceability, and were able to get better returns to the market. In the absence of an undifferentiated market space currently available for sustainable agriculture, because very often much of the things that we produce, local markets and even other kinds of markets, the mandis doesn't make any distinction between something that is more sustainable. I won't call it organic, chemical, or non-chemical or non-pesticidal. That's a matter of degree. But clearly, at least you can say something is sustainable and something is not sustainable. But markets today don't differentiate them at all. And I think that's an area where there is a lot of scope. The absence of a differentiated market is indeed a hurdle for scaling up, as was rightly mentioned. This needs to go much beyond the 5,000 farmers that we're talking of. Yesterday I was looking at the map of PGS organic. The spread in beyond the Vindhyas is very, very thin. It can't be a South India based movement alone. I think there's a lot that needs to happen to engage with larger number of farmers in these places. So maybe in the vision, we would like to see PGS spreading across in whatever form. If it needs to be called by different names, doesn't really matter. I mean, that's what we're kind of seeing in the organic farming movement as well. It can be a differentiator. I think it is an imperative. It's not a hobby or fad anymore. And this needs support. And that's something that needs to be articulated more strongly with some of the policy makers, with SFAC, with NABARD and others. Maybe there is an opportunity because there is a craze for natural farming currently in many parts of the country. But I think the market side of it is not very clear as of now. What we also find interestingly in the business models itself is a sustainable FPO, very different from a normal, what we might call a normal FPO. And I think one of the things we were able to see is that actually the women members and even others have been pushing for stability of revenue over growth. And growth is something that we are sometimes over obsessed with. And sometimes they've had almost a flat trajectory, but have not seen these huge spikes of ups and downs. And I think it doesn't matter whether you're super profitable or not, especially for a collective organization. If you are able to maintain stability, that might be a direction in which what we are finding from the ground from some of these case studies, rather than chasing, major growth. So one way of chasing growth is also to do MSP in 1 year and fall down the next year, or do commodity markets, which are so, can be having a huge amount of fluctuation. Unlike, say, the perishables which we talk of, success largely in dairy cooperatives or sugarcane cooperatives, there is a reasonable stability which I don't think exists in some of these places. So finally, I'd like to say that I think there is a very early stage of discussion on this idea of sustainable transition. We don't do enough work on this in India. How do you manage a sustainable transition? We know things are not working well. In agriculture, if you want to move from an unsustainable system to a sustainable system, institutions play a very important role. And can FPOs play what one might refer to as transition intermediaries? Can they enable this transition from an unsustainable agri-food systems towards a sustainable agri-food system? So that's all I'd like to share with at this point. I've come to learn. I just want to end with mentioning that we are planning to have a 3-day training program on agri-food systems, which is to try, and we are doing this in collaboration with Socrates, which is to try and get us to try and root systems thinking in all our processes. So if some of you would like to participate, I mean, Vishala could send more details about it. So this is from July 18th to 20th at Anand. And I think the challenge is a lot. We'll have to do much, much more in this space. I'm not an expert in organic farming, but I think we need to do more from the management side on how do we root systems thinking principles in driving these institutions and thinking of these institutions very, very differently from the current imagination. Thank you.